now and then, when I crave for a healthy dose of tangy wit, I turn to Virginia Woolf. I repeatedly enjoy her classic, A Room of One's Own. This gem of a book contains pearls of lucidity such as,
women have served all these centuries as looking glasses, possessing the magic and delicious power of reflecting the figure of man at twice its natural size.
And morsels of humor such as,
biscuits and cheese came next, and here the water jug was liberally passed round. For it is the nature of biscuits to be dry, and these were biscuits to the core.
St. Woolf begins the book with a question of women in fiction, and then she proceeds to dismantle the whole notion to shreds. Do we mean women as characters in fiction? Women as writers, as muses of fiction? Women as barred and subordinate afterthoughts in fiction? And so my thoughtscaper and I wonder, but what about women in art? All kinds of art. In a time where a banana peel stuck on a wall is art, what even isn't? And have we contributed to this shift in the creative landscape? Or are women still inane objects with no say and no agency? Enters Fanny Curtat, brilliant academic of the arts, an artist herself, and a literature junkie. Spot on for our conundrum today. So, quasi-feministas, let's shred this topic to pieces. On this episode, we discuss women and art history. So, just to get us started, what on earth can we consider art? And I know that this is a titanic enterprise, but just give us a little bit of a trip. What is art? Let's start there.
Yeah, because since we know that this is an impossible question, let's use it for its potential and use the forbidden shortcuts of history. And why it's interesting is because it associates arts with talent. And it's true, like we associate some sort of mastery of element with art. But that's going to allow us to get pretty quickly into why we got to the banana and how much women contributed to that switch.
This is Fanny, extremely bright, irresistibly charming, and stubbornly humble. If only she was arrogant, she'd be Zeus.
Because why do we say this is a talented person? We tend to associate it with a capacity of an artist to represent reality. Mm-hmm. You know, in the days of old, we associate hyper-realistic painting to somebody who's really talented, Renaissance painting like Leonardo da Vinci. You know, we have this idea that something that looks real, that imitates nature, is sort of what talent is. But the thing is that nature was never really imitated properly. What you're looking at is choices that an artist made in order to represent what we think is some sort of part of reality.
Well, hey there, nice people. All of the works that we will refer to are available in a single link in the description box. Open it now. It will be useful throughout the entire conversation. And just because I want you to chillax, you will hear this sound whenever it's time to take a peek at the images. You're welcome.
So, like, the idea is that talent isn't connected with imitation of reality, but it's never really reality as we think of it. For example, we don't have images of that because it's taking you back to ancient Greek, as art history often does, and that's a problem. We'll get to that. But Xerxes was one of the most famous painter of the era, and in order to represent one female body, he had in front of him 5 women and combine the elements of each woman's body into what he considered to be better than nature.
What a guy! 500 BC and we were already Mr. Potato Head prototypes.
Sometimes representing nature is about enhancing nature, or it's about putting forth what they thought was a superior version of nature. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, a French painter, much later, he has this most famous painting, which is La Grande Odalisque. And you have like this female body that's spread on cushions. And when you look at it, it's beautiful. And it has this sort of satiny, velvety texture to the skin, very sexy, very sensual. The body makes no sense. The boob is too squished on the side. Her back has too many vertebrae. The leg is not in the right angle. Nothing makes sense. This body is not real. If she were to get up, it would be some sort of monster. So what we're seeing is never really reality. It's always choices that an artist makes. Ingres knows how to draw perfectly. He knows how the body works. He can copy reality. This body he chose to make. Okay? Yeah. And when you see these ideas, what you realize is that it's not just technique that is important. It's also their choices in terms of reality. Problem is that over the course of time, here's the first shortcut. I already made one connecting Xerxes and Ingres, but bear with me. Over the course of time, these choices ended up becoming what we associated as the reality that artists needed to represent. And so it sort of made a switcheroo, and it became a norm. It became what was called a canon. Canon originally is like a measurement, but over the course of time, these measurements and mathematical vision of the body and how it should be, they became a canon in the term of reference, artists that we need to imitate. So we're not only imitate reality. Talent is supposed to imitate a reality that's full on subjectivity. This idea became not only a canon and a norm, it became an ideal. And that becomes very problematic because not only it described what art should be, but it determined also what a body should be. The thing also that we have to understand, because, we can see where I'm going with this. The art history is not like a flowing river where everybody was following this canon and everything was fine. The canon evolved. And what shocks us today with the banana peel, every period of time had the equivalent of a banana peel. Every period had codes that artists shattered. A good example for that is Monet, because the Impressionists, there's nothing more quiet or easy to look at than a Monet. Like it's on a cup, it's on a pillowcase, like it's flowers, and we think it's almost a granny sort of art. It's for like an older audience or something. But in its own time, Monet and all of the Impressionists was so radical. See the caricatures of the time in Paris when they did their exhibit, soldiers holding up Impressionist painting to get rid of the enemy because the enemy was so traumatized by these ugly Impressionist paintings. You had a pregnant woman afraid of going in the exhibit because the Impressionist painting would turn her baby into a monster. Just to put it into context.
Something else that I think that we put together with the idea of art is effort, maybe.
Yeah.
For example, if you take hyperrealism, you could potentially decide whether it is close. Does it give you that feeling of that is so real? It absolutely looks like skin. How on earth they did that? Effort must have been put into it. I don't know, is there a moment where we have divorced the idea of skill and effort from the idea of art? Or are we talking just about a different kind of effort, maybe a more intellectual one?
Well, that's what I would argue, but definitely in the scale of the wider audience, the 60s and 70s are the clash. And that's where women come in. Because what we see with this evolution of the canon is that Monet, even though he was shocking, because he stayed, well, first of all, he was still a man. He was still doing paintings. Painting was still a dominating style, so there were still things that even though they were shocking, they were like maintained. When you get to the 60s, 70s, all of this just blows up. Everything explodes. I'm doing a massive, massive shortcut, but it was a time where we were questioning the canvas, we were questioning the academy, we were questioning rules, and we were questioning the nomination of painting mostly and sculpture as the main object for art. The most emblematic example would be Marcel Duchamp's fountain. So he took an object that was already made, rendered it useless by putting it in an awkward position, upside down, and then signed it. Of course, no talent was required into making the object. He didn't even do it. Somebody else did it. What became interesting is these ideas, because when we get lured by talent and by this idea of representing reality a certain way, it's sort of like we get sidetracked and we miss everything else. So I would say like the same effort that would go into something that would require technical ability would then be transferred into ideas and concepts. And that was more meaningful because what they had to explode, and that's where women come in, is that by going through this same idea of what needs to be art, what it needs to represent, what it needs to say, well, then your canon is not so much about inclusion than about exclusion. And so when Marcel Duchamp took this fountain and signed it, it was like saying, because I'm an artist, this is valid work. Look at it differently. It's not an object that functions as a fountain anymore. What is it? What are you really looking at when you're looking at an artwork? You know, and so these questions were necessary because this canon had been going on and on, even though Monet had shocked them at some point. It was still the same ideas. Mm-hmm. Women in the 60s were already going towards this emancipation. And in 71, Linda Nochlin, which is an art curator, she asked in a very famous article, why have there been no great women artists? Which was a legitimate question. And so women at that time, just like men were questioning what art is and what it should be, because they were photography, publicity, Andy Warhol was taking a can of soup. You know, it was going everywhere. We were thinking about images, about the power of images. And then women were like, okay, wait, but this whole thing that you have been describing as art, why aren't we part of it? Why are you saying that this is the norm and we are nowhere to be seen in it? Mm-hmm. You know, that's when really women not only took an opportunity to get into art in a more obvious way, but they took advantage of the fact that painting was no longer the goal. They went through these old medium like installation, video, performance. That's why a lot of their production are very shocking to us, because we tend to think of art as sculpture and painting, which is an object that doesn't scream at you. It won't try to shock you the same way a performance or like an installation will. And so women really took control of this. They really put forth how to use art in meaningful ways to show other aspects of reality than what was dictated by what we now call the white male's gaze. When women brought this, they were like, your point of view are very limited. We need to broaden these. We need to open and show what really is happening, and to see that not only women were excluded, but everybody else that we know of.
All these other vulnerable groups.
Exactly.
Sounds like first approach to stop being invisible, to say, hey, we exist as well, and here's how we see it.
Exactly. And I mean, women have tried before. Like, why have there been no great women artists is more a question about also art history and the way it records and remembers. But there have been some women artists, but they've been the exception. And they were also treated more like as a curiosity. Mm-hmm. Even when they were successful, like Rosa Bonheur in the 19th century was by far the most famous and probably wealthiest painter of her time. But we don't remember her as much as Monet. Art history is a really good window into what happened, because it deals with images. Images are representation, and representation is key. So when we say that, you know, art involves no talent, I think what people, like, it's not just the effort. I think people also cling to an idea of art as being linked to beauty. And I think that when women got into art, they had suffered so much because of beauty, that beauty never was really what they wanted to give the world. Beauty had taken a lot from them, in a sense. And so when you see the evolution of women in art, both as object and as active participants, you see that, and you see how cool it is to have something in front of you that is maybe not pretty, maybe required no effort, but that points to a reality that is beautiful and to an idea that is gorgeous and that took effort to get there, and that just the fact that it's there and being expressed is a feat in and of itself. Mm-hmm. That's what contemporary art is. That's where it's trying to go. The beauty of ideas and accepting all kinds of different approaches to art, but it shouldn't be put into a hierarchy of being better because it required more time to do than somebody who took his own life to be able to get to say that thing or put that object there, even though it required no effort in the object itself.
So I wonder how much of our idea of beauty has been twisted by the way art history developed. And what we would think is beautiful today if art history would have taken a different path. The idea of maternity, for example, and how paintings were a calm mother with her baby and this and that. And that's the view of a guy of what maternity should look like or does look like from the outside. But maybe a woman says, the most beautiful moment for me was when I was covered in blood, when my baby came out of me and they put that baby for the first time in my hands. And maybe that's beautiful to her. And maybe she puts that out there. And to the gaze of us, we're like, oh my God, that's gory, that's disgusting, there's blood. But why are we thinking that? Are we responding to that way? Because we're expecting to see a calm, soft, tender vision of motherhood. Well, that's a creation that is, like you were saying, a very personal decision by a few, whereas this other one might not be your taste, but it is more representative of more people, of other people.
Well, art history is a mirror of what is happening in the culture and the society. It's creating and it's reacting in almost a simultaneous way. The thing that's interesting is to think that even though like criteria for beauty changed enormously over time, and we all know because we've all seen previous paintings and we have sometimes these huge foreheads and very, very pale skin and like almost fish-like eyes. And you're like, oh, is that beautiful? But every period in time had its own criteria for beauty. When you see Rubens, for example, paintings of Rubens, we have Les Trois Grâces and you have these three women in the forest and it's cellulite was okay back then. And that's great, you know?
Yeah,
but it changed.
Bring back the cellulite.
Yeah. 18th century had its plus. But yeah, you know, it's the thing that we need to remember is that beauty would have evolved for sure. It did evolve. It's not a fixed thing. The only thing that was pretty much fixed was that it was determined by people other than women. It was imposed mostly on women and they had to adapt their bodies. Men had to do the same thing also over a course of different times. It just required sometimes less of an effort. They never had a corset for some reason. Nobody invented that for them. When we get to the 60s, a lot of the attention of women go towards a female's view of herself. It's not the first time it happened. A famous example of Artemisia Gentileschi, and it's a representation of Judith and Holofernes, I think we say in English. I'm so used to saying it in French. And Judith is a biblical figure. She is a woman that saved her village from Nebuchadnezzar's general, Holofernes, by seducing him and then cutting his head while he was sleeping. This motif of Judith was represented by many artists. Every time differently. If you want to follow beauty trends over the course of art history, you can take that motif and you'll see how she adapted to different periods. You can see that it's, again, each artist's vision of her. I put another example underneath, which is Caravaggio. He was the same era as Artemisia Gentileschi. He was before he was already very famous. People were imitating his style. Gentileschi picks up a lot from him. But what I like about this picture is that, you know, Caravaggio's Judith is very feminine. She's almost disgusted by the sword going through the neck. And she's very delicate. She manages to cut someone's head and still remain oddly feminine and delicate. And it's like she's cutting butter.
Yeah, she looks disgusted by the person being beheaded, but she's the one that is beheading the person.
Yeah.
So it seems like she's kind of like photoshopped on top of it.
Yeah. And I love putting it next to Artemisia Gentileschi because she is going at it. There's blood spurting everywhere. She has these big arms.
She's on a mission.
Oh yeah, she is strong. Artemisia Gentileschi was raped when she was 19 and she went to court. There was a proceeding because he was an artist working in her father's studio. But of course they had to prove it. She was tortured just to be sure she was telling the truth. And it was a very traumatic ordeal. And a lot of people view her own experience in this version of Judith that she made. What you see is a woman's version of what this hero had to do to save her village. And you see a woman that's not afraid. She has determination on her face. It's not about her being a woman. It's about her being heroic. It's about her being strong. It's about her having revenge. And all of these come true. Whereas in Caravaggio, we have maybe a pretty picture, but a very artificial one.
Mm-hmm.
And so women have been going against this idea of artificial beauty for the longest time. You know, there's this artist, this Japanese artist in the Fluxus movement, like in contemporary art, Shigeko Kubota, I think. One of her most famous performances, she did what was called a vagina painting. She stuck like a paintbrush to her underwear and she was dipping it into the red paint bucket and she was painting, being crouched with this blood. And so going back to what you were saying about this idea of motherhood being represented in blood, and that's a little bit what she was doing there. Taking something that's hidden, something that's taboo, putting it forward and showing that why is it taboo? Why is that something we should hide?
Mm-hmm.
And so the art of this period, especially the 60s, 70s, it's breaking down walls. It's strong. It needs to send a message. Like I said, women have tried playing by men's rules. Artemisia Gentileschi is an example, but there were a lot of other women who tried to represent the canon, who tried to represent what men were doing. They were trying to do the same. Until the 19th century, they weren't allowed in studios and art academies. So
Exactly.
they were mostly excluded because of that.
And also there's plenty of stories of female artists that had their artwork stolen or the credit taken by someone else because they knew they were never going to make it simply because, they had a vagina.
Yeah. And I mean, this great picture, even when Academy started, it's the 18th century. For the first time, it was like 34 founding members and there were 2 women amongst them. So that was great. But then you have a painting that shows just how awkward it was for men to include women. And this painter, he's called Johann Zoffany, I think it is. And these 2 women, Mary Moser and Angelica Kaufman, they are not represented in this group of men. They are, I think, in a nude session. And so, of course, women weren't allowed to participate in those. They weren't allowed to observe a nude body, and so they couldn't learn anatomy. Anatomy was a big deal in the canon. If we remember that canon originally means measurement of the body. So in this painting that represents the founder, where are the 2 women? They are on the wall as portraits. And that is just such a fitting representation of what it was. Even in Raphael, the School of Athens, where you have all of these philosophers, and Plato has the face of Leonardo da Vinci. Well, maybe he has the face. It's, it remains to be seen. But there's all this idea of art being intellectual, art being a science, fascinating on a philosophical point of view. Women are part of the decor in that they're all caryatides, these figures that are sort of a column in architecture, and also a pretty fitting representation of their place in art history thus far. It's a very troubling history, and that's why in the 70s, women needed to punch. It was really about punching somebody in the face. We've tried playing by your rules. We've tried to correspond to what you guys want us to do. We've did painting, sculpting, because some art was still part of being an accomplished woman, but it was considered minor, like embroidery or like painting flowers, a woman and child. All of this was for women, and it was not the canon. And women have tried, never worked. And so by the 70s, they were like punching people in the face with their pieces. Okay, fine, you need to listen to us. We need to make an impression. One of my favorite pieces from that time, and it's very, very troubling, and there's a great TED Talk about it from the artist herself, Marina Abramovic, called Rhythm Zero. And in the room, there was a table with 72 objects on it. Objects for pleasure, objects for pain, a flower, there was a glass of water, there was a chair, there was a shoe, there was all sorts of ambiguous objects like a hammer, a metal pipe, a knife, razor blades, a gun with a bullet. And on this table with all these objects above, there was a notice that said, for the duration of this, you can do whatever you want. I take full responsibility. At the end of the 6 hours, 6 hours, mind you, is a long time to give your power to an audience. During this time, at the beginning, people were sort of timid, and she tells it super well, like really, go listen to her. People were sort of timid, and some of them were kind and offering her water and giving her the rose. And then it sort of evolved, and then somebody took the thorn from the rose and stuck them in her stomach. Somebody cut her with a razor blade on the neck. They carried her on the table. They put the knife between her legs. Somebody eventually put the gun to her head. Then the audience started fighting amongst themselves. She says herself that she thinks the only reason she wasn't raped was because it was in an art setting and the men were there with their wives. But still, there was something very, very powerful about the fact that when you think of somebody as an object, or when you're led to think of somebody as an object, it gets very easy to do things to them. Because at the end of these 6 hours, she sort of snapped out. She was covered in blood, tears. At the end of it, she sort of regained her own power, and she started walking towards the audience. And then they sort of all lost it and sort of disappeared and ran away. Because when you think of somebody as a human being, a woman, in her own right as a person, then you won't stick thorns in her belly. But when you're led to think of her as an object, then of course they'll do whatever they want with her. She's the same thing as the hammer or the rose on this table. And so these were very powerful action. It's not about talent in the sense of something, an effort into representing a reality, a painting or such. It's about something much more important that breaks this canvas, goes beyond what we think art should be, what we think women should be, and makes us see things in a different way. It was a very, very powerful work. Everything she does is very powerful.
I would bet that not a lot of people would have thought of this idea, and not a lot of people would have dared to execute it. There's a level of bravery that is beyond. And it is something that has confronted us with, maybe it's our temperament, maybe it's our nature, I don't know. But she managed, she had the talent to confront us with it.
Yeah.
Years ago, I worked with a Japanese company. They were contemporary dancers. That was fantastic. That was a fucking fantastic, held back with considerable effort. Did you catch it? The choreography was called shoku, which means touch, and it was performed by the Japanese contemporary dance company Batik. And there was one moment in the performance where one of the dancers, this particular moment was a solo, she danced, and then she finished by pulling her skirt. It was a long red skirt. Pulls it forward, not showing her body, but then starts spitting, truly spitting, this is not a prop, onto her skirt, and creating this stain, and then the lights went out. And I remember asking the director, she was phenomenal. The choreographer was Ikuyo Kuroda, and I dare you to watch Shoku and remain indifferent to her work. What was that bit about? She said dancing was not enough to portray what I wanted to portray. I needed to get to the audience in a visceral way. That's what I needed in that moment of my choreography. Yeah. Somebody can say, ugh, just disgusting. What is that? Well, she made me feel exactly what she wanted me to feel. I was shocked. I was curious. I was shaken. Yeah. And she was masterful to make me go through it.
Yeah. And I think that what they did by showing these very troubling ideas, they picked up on the power that art already had before. Like for me, art history is about accepting all types of art. And it's even more real with contemporary art. It really has to do with empathy. We're looking at artists' choices. And so really when we're looking at a piece of art, our reaction shouldn't be, I like it, I don't like it. It should be, why this way? She could have done so many things else. Why did she do that specifically? Why that and why not that thing? This puts you in a much more receptive mindset than most activities. It's basically empathy in a nutshell.
This reminds me of 2019, when in Mexico City, in a protest against feminicides and the government's uselessness, a young lady spontaneously began to dance, releasing her anger and her grief. She was mocked mercilessly in social media. Nobody asked why dance and why not something else, but everybody reacted quickly and harshly.
And this way, it engages sort of a dialogue with art, but also with the world around you and with the people behind it. Art is about connection. And I think that that's what women were trying to do. And not just women, because we'll have to get into also people of color, because, you know, once you get to the 70s, it's still very much white women against white men. It's not all against. There were partnerships. Let's not get carried away. But it was mostly like a white women thing. As it evolved through the different waves of feminism, then we got people of color who got into this with their own culture and were like, wait, that's your version of feminism. Like, that's your version of what womanhood is. That's not mine. We can't just have one vision of womanhood. That's not right. And so it expanded and it expanded and it keeps expanding. And having a feminist point of view on art history sort of contributes to the same movement of queer studies, post-colonial studies. It's about broadening everything and about activating this really empathic level of art, where when you see something you don't understand, well, you at least have to try to understand.
That was just wonderful, Fanny. Art as therapy, because there will be groups of people that really struggle with inclusion. Of course, this is not a justification, but simply because of their upbringing, their surroundings, their generation.
Yeah.
And I wonder if a good visit to a museum under that perspective, on the idea of openness, on the idea of questioning why, instead of I like or I don't like, would be a first, psychological approach to not simply fall onto the automatic response of disgust or attraction.
Yeah.
Just going to a museum, choosing one room and saying, okay, I'm just going to take it all in without prejudgment and see what happens. Yeah. In talking about that, I was wondering, we could pull out a painting and maybe you can walk us through how you would analyze or look at a painting. So next time we are confronted with a piece of art, maybe we can see it with different eyes. Would you like to do that?
Of course. I love doing that. That's the main thing. I would say for today, and this artist, she passed away in 2018, and she struggled her whole life with recognition, and people realized the value of her work much later on. And I'd like us to look at her work.
This is a good moment to scroll down to the last 2 images in the link. The work is by the artist Laura Aguilar from her photography series, Grounded.
When you were talking about just art therapy and about openness, she's the perfect vessel for that. That's what a lot of women and people of color brought forth, in the sense that by showing themselves and by showing who they are outside of the norm, they also offer a mirror for somebody else to see himself and recognize himself and form a community. I'm giving away a lot of what's in the image right now, but like, she has a very, very powerful work. First of all, when you're in front of the object, you have to ask yourself the question of scale. On which scale is this piece talking to you? Assuming you're in a museum, pandemic is over, you're in front of an art piece yourself. Is it small? Is it tall? How is it affecting your body? How is it communicating to you on that scale? Next, when you have an image like this, you need to ask yourself, what are you looking at? Describe it and get into it. In this case, we see the artist herself. It's her own body in the desert. Okay? And having people in the desert, having views of the desert in itself, it's a common thing. You have examples in your mind. Men have dominated the style of landscape for years. But in this case, not only is it a landscape, it's sort of a portrait. Again, what type of portrait is it? When you think of a portrait, you think of somebody looking at you. You think of this very almost like passport photo pose in front of you. Portrait, again, another thing where men have been very successful at. In this case, we sort of have a mix of a portrait of a landscape, and neither of them are represented in what you would assume they would be. What we see is the body of the artist herself, but it's almost like we're not invited to see it as a body. We're almost invited to see it as part of the landscape itself. like the landscape is accepting it or she's accepting it herself. There's this connection between the two. And the same thing as a rock that's behind her, making a parallel with the shape of her body. The rock to us is natural and beautiful and something that's part of our world just the way it is, that we accept without even questioning. And in front of us, we have this same shape, evocative of the rock, that we should treat the same way, that we should try to see how it connects to this landscape and how it connects to us. Asking yourself, what am I seeing? Is she facing me? Is she from the back? Is it a body? Is it more like a shape? Where is it in the image? What type of lighting it is? All of these questions are choices the artist made. And all of these choices are a decision that are her language. For her especially, she was trying to communicate so much through images when it was sometimes difficult for her to express it otherwise. What you're looking at is somebody's message, somebody's impression of reality. Like in a nutshell. I went very quickly. Like there's a lot to be said about her work.
That was absolutely beautiful, Fanny. I don't think I can add anything else. Thank you so much for our conversation today. And I'm kind of hoping that maybe we can do a few more if you're up for it.
My pleasure.
But for today, thank you so much. It was absolutely beautiful.
Thank you. I'm so happy. Thanks to you. Bye-bye.
Art is an exercise in empathy, a brave and open consideration to the experience and perspectives of the other being highlighted, underscored, and in italics. For centuries, the other has been silenced, shunned, belittled, ignored, condemned, ridiculed, rendered powerless. But this is no more. Spoiler alert, St. Wolf's conclusion is that a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction.
And that leaves the great problem of the true nature of woman and the true nature of fiction unsolved.
Who today does not have a room of their own? Who are the people that we are now keeping silenced, shunned, belittled, ignored, condemned, ridiculed, and powerless? Next time you're confronted with a work of art, an idea, or even a person that makes you feel some discomfort, may I suggest resetting? Start with the question of why, because, as Fanny said, at least we need to try. Quasi Feminista is recorded in a plethora of rooms of our own around the globe. Special thanks to Deborah Woodage for her cameo appearance as Virginia Woolf. Original music, Flor de Maria. Editing, Erika Medellin. Fact-checking and comic relief, Chatty Patty. As always, this episode is done with the support of the Ministry of Women and the Testicular Council. I'm Patricia Morales, Cid de León.